Okay, hi everyone. This is our biology review, and hopefully you can hear me. This is my first time doing this, so feel free to type questions in, and I think I will be able to see them as you do so. I do have questions that my class gave me, so I'll just start answering those. And if you have questions, then type them, and I'll interrupt what I'm saying to start answering you. Okay? Um, okay. I hope you can hear me. Let me just set something up really quickly to make sure I can see everything. Okay, so I am going to put, oh, okay. Arul, I see you have a question. Can I answer number 1 and number 2 for the A-level questions? Okay, so let me pull those up so I can see them. I assume you mean the sample questions that I gave you. Now, for my class, remember, those are samples. It's not the questions in your actual exam. Um, so just keep that in mind. I can't say that for the other teachers. That's not necessarily the case. Okay, let me pull up the questions. Let's see. Okay, so number 1 and number 2. Let me see. I'm gonna put it so I have a split screen here and I can see things. Let's see. Okay, so the idea here is to think about how climate change is linked to things like fossil fuels, etc. Right? So, if I were going to answer the question, I would talk about, first of all, the fact that the greenhouse effect is not man made, right? It's the idea that we have these greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor. They're in the atmosphere. And what they do is they trap some of the heat and so therefore make the earth warm enough to live in, right? The problem then comes when we add extra carbon dioxide, which are fossil fuel, I'm sorry, greenhouse gases, because when you do that, now you end up with more carbon dioxide in the environment, then the more heat is trapped, the temperature gets warmer, which would be global warming, right? And that happens because of the fossil fuels. Now, someone earlier in my third period did ask me what the link was between the carbon cycle and electronics. Is the idea is that in order to use conventional electricity, it takes, remember, energy is not created from nowhere, right? It's converted from somewhere else. So that means probably some fossil fuels and other things are being burned in order to make those, to make that energy, right? To convert it into electrical energy that then runs your household and all your electronics. So the idea would be if you're burning more of those, you're taking more carbon out of the earth where it's being stored through biological carbon cycles, right? I'm sorry, geological carbon cycles, and now you're putting it into the atmosphere, right? And that's going to cause then effects of climate change because now when the earth gets warmer, we have things like rising sea levels, it changes, the weather patterns get more extreme. So all these things become a little bit more pronounced, right? Okay, hopefully that kind of gives you an idea. Let's see, number 2 has to do with the water cycle. Um, Remember, the idea is technically the natural water cycle is completely renewable, right? Water evaporates, it falls back down to earth, it goes into a river or a stream, it evaporates again, etc. Right? So the problem is when humans get involved with that, right? We aren't just letting the water cycle in and out, right? We are taking our water, we're using it for all sorts of things like washing our dishes and, um, you know, toilets, sinks, etc. Right? So in that sense, like water is getting polluted. Now, yes, we do try to clean it out somewhat through, wastewater treatment plants, but realistically, the water is what we call a limited renewable resource because if we just keep polluting it, it's not going to renew itself at the same rate that we need it to. So that's where it becomes problematic. So certainly the natural water cycle is sort of the idea that water is just moving all around. But when the man-made cycle comes into play, then we have to be careful because water, there's tons of water in the earth, right? Oceans, tons and tons of water. But the problem becomes we can't really use that ocean water, right? And we talked about some of the water sustainability, so certainly like um, recycling water for certain things that we don't have to have it, be drinkable or whatnot. desalination in an ideal sense. If we could desalinate the water, like take the salt out of the water, we could do a lot of stuff with it, but that's not a realistic way to get water right now. Um, and also just aspects of conservation and things like that. Okay, let's see. I see another question that says, what are some physical effects of global warming that could also be applied to climate change? Okay, I'm not entirely sure what you mean there. I think if I'm reading your question correctly, would be something to the effect of, if global warming occurs, right? Um, then how might we see that like physical changes? I don't know if I'm reading your question correctly. I think certainly the first one is going to be the, as it gets warmer, right? Remember, water is getting warmer too. Like when the entire Earth's temperature is getting higher, then we are also seeing the temperatures of the ocean rise, right? So the physical effects, let me make sure I see this question, um, would be, you see the sea levels rising. Of course, that's going to have a lot of possible implications, right? Because number one, the ocean rising means that coastal ecosystems are now going to be disturbed, right? Something that's not normally underwater and now is not going to do well, like you know. Um, so I think that, and then it also just affects it, can affect currents and things like that. I would imagine it also then changes weather patterns and things like that. Let's see. Oh, sorry, I see a lot of questions. Okay, I'm gonna keep going here. Chippo. So a rule, I said you were absent. Make sure somebody gives you notes or send me an email and I will send you the notes. Sahana, you said for Chippo, what does over exploitation mean? It means that certainly if we use some products like lumber or fishing, that's okay, right? But the problem is we've kind of done it to excess. We're cutting down too many trees. We are overfishing the species, so there's not enough of them, and that's affecting like how big they grow. So that's what overexploitation means, is we're sort of taking a resource that we use and sort of overdoing it. A carbon footprint. I see someone's asking what a carbon footprint is. A carbon footprint is basically the idea of like how much carbon are you using, right? I mean, in the sense that like in terms of like fossil fuels. So if we kind of counted up like how much carbon we use for something like driving to school or running your, dishwasher, all those things, like a person's carbon footprint is sort of the idea of like how much carbon are you releasing into the atmosphere. Let's see. Why does the population fluctuate around carrying capacity? Well, remember that, the graph you saw, the logistic curve, the S curve, is not like a real life mod. It's not a real life data, right? It's sort of a model. So the idea is that we know that the population is going to start growing and it's going to kind of get a little bit higher. It's going to start growing exponentially initially, and then it's going to get to a certain point where it levels off, right? And when it levels off, then the problem is that it's it is there it's real life, right? So let's say we have bunnies in an ecosystem. That means that those bunnies, it's not like they're going to say, oh, my carrying capacity is 300, so bunny number 301, you just can't come out, you can't be born yet, right? That doesn't work. So what actually happens is there is a number that the environment can support, right, that they can sustain, but no actual organism is aware of that. So there's going to be what we call like an overshoot, where it's actually going to grow a little bit past that carrying capacity, but that means there's not enough resources to support them. So the population is going to go down a little bit and then it'll go up a little bit. So when it's at carrying capacity, it means it can hold at that level, but it's not like an exact number. So it's going to be like 305 and then 299 and then 310 and like 292. Like the idea is it was just going to fluctuate. Carrying capacities, I see someone is asking, carrying capacity is the maximum number of organisms that the environment can support. And that's going to depend on a lot of different factors, right? Like how much space is there for nests, if it's something that nests, how much food resources are there, right? Um, um, go talk to Jalen. Sorry, I have little people who will. Okay, let's see. I see someone asking, what is the difference between Sorry. What? Oh, okay, I see someone answering. Okay, what is the difference between the greenhouse effect and ozone? Okay, so first of all, in the atmosphere, there's a lot of different gases, right? There is carbon dioxide, there's water, vapor, there's methane. And so the idea is ozone is another one of those gases. There's actually not a ton of it, but they all do different things. So the greenhouse effect is the idea that the CO2, the methane, the water vapor will trap the heat and therefore make Earth warm enough to survive. Ozone, on the other hand, does a different job. Ozone is like, when we saw the video in class, ozone basically blocks um, the UV rays coming from the sun. So it's like our Earth's sunscreen. So when the ozone layer gets destroyed, we now have more UV rays getting down to us and it becomes more dangerous. So, two different types of things these gases are doing. Let's see. I see. What is the relationship between geological and biological cycles, and how are humans impacting or changing these cycles? Okay. So, geological generally refers to like things that are happening in the earth, right? Like weathering, sedimentation, like, rocks formation, things like that, right? Biological cycles would be things that are involving living things, right? Probably things that would involve probably more like, um, you know, photosynthesis, cellular respiration, etc. Humans, I don't, it depends on sort of which cycle. Humans definitely have an impact on it, right? Like if we take things out of the ground more or we cut down trees, like that's how we could impact or change those cycles because not at the level of like one individual organism, but more at the idea of like how many different, um, how much carbon we're releasing or absorbing, right? Um, Let's see. Let's see, I'm going to try. Is anything from a living thing a biotic factor? Yeah, pretty much. Biotic factors means that it came from something living or it is itself living, right? Now, it also gets a little bit more uh, abstract in that a biotic factor could also be something that involves living things. Something like predation is not a it's not like a physical thing, right? I mean, it's an interaction, but that's also a biotic factor. Let's see. What are some potential impacts of climate change on humanity and biodiversity? So hold on a second. I'm just going to close the door here so my children don't run in here. Okay. So some potential I see that question twice. I'm guessing it must be from something else then. Um, so potential impacts of climate change on humanity dividers. Well, for certainly, you know, if the earth warms too much, it's going to impact humanity in a lot of different ways, right? I mean, we're looking at the destruction of neighborhoods and areas, you know, if they go underwater and things like that. Certainly, the extreme weather patterns are concerning, right? Because that's going to cause, death and destruction. And it's the same for biodiversity, right? I mean, if you have sea levels rise, if you have hurricanes and things running through, like also the natural ecosystems are going to be affected. Okay, what are the fast short term? Sorry, these are jumping. What are the fast short term and slow long term parts of the carbon cycle? Okay, for my students, I didn't cover that in too much detail, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. The idea behind that really is that the carbon cycle has aspects where carbon moves in and out of things really fast. Things like cellular respiration, photosynthesis, right? Where it's turning over really quickly. It's coming in and out very quickly. And then the slow long term parts are things where like the carbon's going to go in there and potentially stay in there for a really long time. Like for example, like fossil fuels don't form quickly, right? So it's probably it's going down there, it's depositing, it's forming it, and it's definitely going to take a while to get there, but it's also probably going to stay there a really long time. Thermal expansion, I believe, is just the idea that when things warm up, like water, that it will expand, right? So when water gets warmer, it expands. And in terms of the natural cycles, that means that the ocean levels will rise. Serbi. Oh, okay. Thank you for answering a rules question. Um, some threats to maintaining California's water supply. Sorry. Well, definitely, conservation is huge, right? I mean, in the past few years, we haven't had nearly as much rain, which meant not as much. The snowpack did not build up as much, which means the snowpack is like our saved water, right? So in the summertime, the idea is the snow from the snowpack is going to melt, come down the rivers, and we can use it for drinking water in the summertime when there's probably not actually as much rain, but we need the water still. So the problem is, um, if we don't do that, right, then, potentially we're going to run out of water. And water is used by certainly all of us for our homes, but also the whole Central Valley where there's a huge industry of agriculture and farming. They don't have the water to water their crops, then that's going to have a really large impact. Um, so I would say, a big part of it is the weather, right? I mean, without enough rain and snow, we have a problem then. Okay, let's see. Let's see. Why are we changing? Let's see. Why are we changing from the geological carbon cycle to the biological carbon cycle? Um, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. Um, both cycles, I think, exist, right? I think it's just the idea that one of them is going to be a little faster in turnover, whereas the geological tends to be a little slower. So if carbon moves around fast, is that a bad thing? It's not that it's a bad thing. I think it's more of, I mean, not it's not universally bad, right? But I think the idea is that if we are increasing the amount of carbon dioxide that's being released, and not as much is necessarily being absorbed, right? Then it's just staying in the atmosphere. Now it's causing an increase in greenhouse gases, which traps more heat, which now causes all the other things we were talked about. What causes ocean acidification? Well, that's actually very much related to what we are just talking about because they were hoping in the past that all this extra carbon dioxide in the environment, in the atmosphere, would just get absorbed by the oceans. But they didn't anticipate that when that happened, it would have a negative impact on the oceans. So for the oceans, what happened was the remember it diffuses, right? That's the one thing that releases and absorbs carbon dioxide, where diffusion is happening between the ocean and the atmosphere. So when CO2 goes in, well, what it's going to essentially break down into is carbonic acid, which is going to lower the pH of the ocean water. And that is harmful because it's going to affect the organisms who live in the water. It also, when the carbon dioxide goes into the ocean, it's going to affect the ability of organisms to build like their carbonate skeletons because the acid basically competes with the compound that would be used. So you can't form the calcium carbonate. So all of those things are going to be problematic. Okay, what exactly do CFCs do? Um, CFCs basically um, are called chlorofluorocarbons. They used to be found in a lot of um, aerosols. So probably more like in the 1980s, 1990s was when they kind of figured out that they were basically interacting with the ozone. And when they interact with the ozone, they would destroy it. They would actually break it apart. And so that was what was affecting the ozone layer. And that was now allowing more UV rays to get through um, to the Earth. Okay, how does metabolism contribute to the carbon cycle? Well, metabolism is basically a fancier name, sort of, for so for cellular respiration, right? So metabolism is contributing to the carbon cycle because when you do cellular respiration, you are actually releasing carbon dioxide. Like when you exhale, through the process of your body doing the reactions of cellular respiration, you are making carbon dioxide. So we are releasing carbon dioxide. So that's how it's related. Let's see. If we are, oh, sorry, skipped. If we're increasing the amount of carbon, how does it affect it? Again, it just adds to, I think with a cycle, it's not like it's a wheel that's just constantly turning, right? Um, it's more that what happens is like things leave a certain place and they're going to a different location. Like the carbon is, the glucose in your body, you're exhaling it, now it goes in the atmosphere, right? And so ideally what we want sort of to have something then cycling it back into a plant through photosynthesis or something like that. But if we keep pumping more out, and not putting as much back in as quickly, that's the problem. What kind of ecosystem is the SF Bay? I don't know if you mean the SF Bay area or the SF Bay in general. It kind of depends on the exact area. A lot of our Bay Area is what they call the chaparral. Um, there's also near the bay itself. There's like some wetlands and things like that. So it kind of depends. Yeah, an estuary is more the idea of where freshwater and seawater meet, but it's not an ecosystem per se. Um, let's see other questions. Give me a second here. Okay, so let me see your questions here. Oh, okay, here we go. Um, okay, the difference between this is what is the difference between renewable and sustainable? So renewable means that you can basically regenerate it, right? Sustainable is more the idea like can we keep it up? So they're not question. Why is global warming a positive feedback loop? Okay. Um, Again, my students, I didn't talk about positive feedback loops, so don't worry about that. But Sonia, I will address that for a moment. Global warming, remember the idea is that, the earth is getting warmer, right? But when that happens, a positive feedback loops means that you kind of keep making it go more and more, right? So the problem is if you kind of keep, if things get warmer and then um, probably traps more heat, which causes more things to happen. So again, I think the idea is that the temperature continues to decrease because the factors that make the temperature increase are getting, continuing to be there. What is logistic growth? So logistic growth is also called the S curve. It's the idea that initially a population grows slowly, then it will start to grow exponentially for a short time, but then it will level off at what we call the carrying capacity. How does thawing of the permafrost increase global warming? So permafrost is basically like frozen ground, more or less. It's often found in um, it's basically found in like Alaska, higher areas, higher latitudes where it's a lot colder. And so the problem is in this case is there's carbon dioxide trapped in the permafrost, right? So when it's really cold, it stays trapped there. But as the permafrost actually starts to thaw and melt, it releases the carbon dioxide. And that means, again, now you're adding to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, right? That's going to cause there to be more heat trapped by the greenhouse gases. And so then the temperatures get higher. Ecosystem services. I didn't actually use that term, so I'm not entirely sure. So I will have to get back to you on that one because that's not one I used. Okay, let's see. How is the San Francisco estuary majorly impacted by climate change? I think to be honest, it's not like it's already done. So I think to a large extent, um, it's still ongoing, right? But I think one of the things I definitely do worry about, of course, is that those areas closer to the water, as sea levels rise, that's probably going to be the most directly, quickly impacted. Okay. What is the geological carbon cycle? Again, I think I mentioned that before, but it's the idea that carbon being sort of deposited into the earth, whether through its or deposition, so or erosion, right? Those things where it sort of slowly comes in and out of rocks and things like that. Joshua, how much energy is lost and how much energy is gained when energy is moved up the food chain? Well, no energy is gained in the sense that you can't make energy from nothing, right? So all of the energy ultimately originates from the sun. And remember, you are just converting it into a different form of energy as it moves through a food chain. So as you move up the food chain, remember that the organism itself is using the energy in cellular respiration. It's using it for, and so that's going to also generate heat. So it loses about 90 it basically uses or loses 90% of the energy. And so it's only about 10% on average that it can transfer to the next level. Okay, why is it difficult to get a worldwide consensus on how to reduce greenhouse gases? That's a great question. Unfortunately, it's not one I think I can answer, right? I think it's complicated. You have all these different countries with different things that they want to focus on. Um, and there's different beliefs out there too, right? So I think that to get that many people to agree on something is not always easy, and that's obviously proven to be very difficult in this case too. Okay, let's see. Skipping around. Okay. Uh, how human activities cause global warming and describe at least two physical effects of global warming. The part of climate change. So again, human activity. A big part of it is when we release more um, carbon into the atmosphere. That's a big issue, right? And then that's going to cause the global warming, which then triggers things like sea level rise, um, patterns of extreme weather, etc. Okay. How does energy flow relate to metabolism? Well, energy flow relates to the idea of how we generally how we're talking about how energy moving up of a food chain, right? But as you move up the food chain, everything that's living is doing metabolism, and so when it does metabolisms, it does metabolic reactions, I should say, is probably a more accurate way of saying it. Then it's going to be both using some of that energy, which is then not available to the next level, right? And it's going to release some of it as heat. So that's how they're all kind of related. What can change the carrying capacity of a species? Um, Basically, lots of things, right? Carrying capacity just means like in that particular ecosystem, like um, what can happen, right? And so, um, if you let's say all of a sudden you have more predators, right? Maybe the carrying capacity goes down because now they're going to be hunted more. Or maybe a better example is like food. Um, Food sources, right? If there's not as much food available, again, the carrying capacity goes down. Or let's say now you have all this extra space for some reason, right? Carrying capacity could go up. So lots of different things can change it. Let's see. Um, let's see. Two major. I think I already talked about the major impacts of climate change, so I will again keep it as we're not entirely certain yet, right? I mean, there's things ongoing, but probably a big part of it is, um, the rising sea levels. Let's see. So what you're saying is that many countries. Well, yeah. Well, I mean, yes. Essentially, countries. Well, when you're talking about like policy, right? Getting everybody to agree on something is difficult. So while there might be a lot of people who think that, you know, think we need to change greenhouse gas levels or things like that, or limit carbon emissions to maintain, things. Not everybody's going to agree on that, and it's complicated. Uh, okay, Brian. What is the water cycle? The water cycle is essentially waterways, right? The idea that you have two cycles, the man-made cycle and the what we call the constructed cycle, and the natural water cycle, right? Um, the natural water cycle would be the idea that water evaporates and then it condenses and it precipitates and it falls back down and then it would do it all again. The water um, um, the constructed water cycle is now when humans get themselves involved, right? So that's how we like take the water from a river and we, put it in a dam and we now take it to the reservoir. And now from the reservoir, we take it to the water treatment plant and from the water treatment to our houses. So we've constructed a different loop that is now not just the natural water cycle. Can I please explain the greenhouse gas effect? Yes, I can. Um, so again, the greenhouse gas effect is the idea that in the atmosphere you have certain greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and water. And so they actually trap heat, and that's what makes the earth warm enough for us to survive on. Otherwise, it would be way too cold. Joshua, does the ozone layer absorb only UV? We believe so. I mean, it could do other things, right? But for us, I think for our purposes, that's what it does. A carbon tax is the idea. Joy, I'm going to have you go back to the earlier in the lecture to get fast and slow carbon cycles. But the idea overall is that, how fast carbon moves in and out of something can either be like super fast with like biological organisms or much slower, like, forming rocks and things like that. A carbon tax, I think, is the idea that, you know, There could be essentially like taxes placed on someone who emits too much carbon. Right? Okay, the difference between biomagnification and bioaccumulation. So both have to do with a toxin entering the food chain, right? And the difference is, first of all, there are water soluble things and there are fat soluble things. So something that's water soluble means like you take it in, but then you're gonna pee it out. So that in that sense, it's not gonna stay in you, right? But something like a toxin tends to be fat soluble, in which case it's actually once the organism eats it, it stays in their body, which now means whoever eats that organism also gets the toxin, right? So, bioaccumulation is the idea that as an organism, big or small, eats more and more of the toxin, it's going to build up in their body. It basically accumulates in their tissues. Biomagnification is the idea that as you now move up a food chain, right? So initially, this little tiny plant probably just takes in a little bit of the toxin. It's not really enough to hurt it, right? But now the fish who eats the plant is not just going to eat one plant. They're actually going to eat lots of that plant, right? So as they eat more and more of the plant, they keep accumulating more and more of the toxin. And now they have more toxin in them than the plant did simply because they ate a whole bunch of the plants. And then whoever eats the fish, let's say a bird, right, now is going to eat a lot of the fish. So they build up the toxin. So as you move up a food chain, biomagnification is the idea that the organisms higher up on the food chain have a higher concentration of the toxin. Some ways to conserve water. Um, Ways to conserve water obviously would be, taking shorter showers, um, things like that. Reusing your water for things like, let's say you're waiting for your water to warm up in the shower. If you like collect it in a bucket and then use it to like water your plants, that's going to save things, right? How do organisms interact with their environment and each other and ecosystem? Well, there's lots of ways, right? I mean, certainly interacting with ecosystem could be just in your environment could be like, where you're sleeping, right? Your habitat where you live, but also like each other. There's lots of things. There's predator and prey relationship. There's mutualism. There's commensalism, etc. Um, in terms of the characteristics, like for my classes, yes, I gave you a reading, and the way they describe them are different, but in the end, they're all the same. No matter if you say there's 8 or 9, I'm not going to ask you to like name them all and put them in numbers. So just as long as you know the things that make something alive from either the way we talked about it in the lecture or the reading is okay. Let's see. What are the impacts of climate change on humanity and biodiversity? I'm going to have you go to an earlier part of the lecture to look at that. A germline cell, it just means a cell that sort of gives rise to other cells. So I wouldn't worry about that right now either. We're going to talk about cells in the next unit. Why is it if your house gets water from a well, it goes to a septic tank instead of the SFB? So the idea is that if your house gets water from a well, it means you're actually not connected to the water um, like system, right? So like you don't have water flowing into you from the water treatment plant. So what you're doing when you get water from a well is you're actually like digging a hole that's deep enough to basically tap into an aquifer nearby and take water from there. Well, if you don't have water pipes flowing to your house, right, you also don't have water pipes flowing away from your house. So it means you don't have your water from your sink or your toilet is not going to the wastewater treatment plant. But you don't want to just spew it out dirty like that, right? So it goes to a septic tank, which is basically like a makeshift wastewater treatment plant in the ground near your house. And then it will basically, clean it out that way in a sort of less complicated manner. By burning fossil fuels, we are, what does it say? Oh, let's see. What happens? Hold on, let's see. I skipped some questions. Okay. By burning fossil fuels, we are releasing CO2, which is a greenhouse. Okay. And that contributes to global warming because greenhouse gases re-emit heat mass. Yeah, more or less. I mean, the idea is that greenhouse gases trap heat, right? So if you're trapping more heat, then the overall temperature of the Earth is getting warmer. Let's see. What happens to water after it goes to a septic tank? And it's essentially it will be after that water is cleaned out, it will be released essentially into probably the soil nearby or something like that, and then it just soaks in, I would imagine. How does climate change affect biodiversity? Again, when you start having ecosystems destroyed by rising sea levels, etc., that's going to affect how many species you're going to have in there. What's the difference between metabolism and cellular respiration? Cellular respiration is more actually technically a specific part of metabolism. Like metabolism is just all the reactions that an organism goes through um, to survive, and cellular respiration is one fairly large part of that. Does weathering in rocks result in carbon being released? And so how? Well, weathering in rocks means yeah, it does, first of all. It's the idea that when like wind or water hits a rock, right, it's breaking that rock apart, and those little pieces of carbon are now breaking apart and they're now being released from that rock. In class, we did a circle question activity, and in that, there was a question about what kind of fish you can eat from this week. I don't necessarily need you to know what kind of fish to eat. It's the idea, again, of biomagnification, right? That mercury is a toxin that can get into the water from like factories and things like that. And the place that it's showing up in how it affects humans is it biomagnifies as it moves up the food chain. So when it does that, certain fish now become higher in mercury content than others, and mercury can be very dangerous to humans. So I don't need you to know like what kind of fish to eat. Think of it as more like the fish that are higher on the food chain are the ones you don't want to eat. And that's going to be true no matter if you live here or anywhere else. Do fresh water from rivers or lakes go straight to a water treatment plant? They don't naturally go there, first of all, right? We have to divert them there. Um, but what we would probably do is we would probably essentially, what they probably do is they create a dam and that blocks some of the rivers and lakes, right? And that is a reservoir. And then that sort of collects that water in a reservoir. And then the reservoir would then pump the water through probably aqueducts and things like that to the water treatment plant. Um, how exactly do greenhouse gases make the earth warmer? Again, they trap the heat. Like the infrared heat that's coming off of the earth essentially can't escape back out into space. Therefore, the earth, it's like a blanket, right? Then it keeps the earth warmer. How does the man-made water cycle affect the natural water cycle? Um, I think that it doesn't necessarily, it does in the sense that we are tapping into it, right? So they don't have to I mean, it doesn't have to have a negative effect on it per se, I think. And the natural water cycle is just the idea that if we left it all alone, it would just evaporate, condense, precipitate, and do it all again. Um, okay, how do toxins undergo biomagnification in food chain? Okay, so again, the idea is that when you get the toxin in, um, as it moves up the food chain, it gets more concentrated because the organisms above are always eating more of the organisms lower on the trophic levels. Okay, can you explain the difference between non-point source pollution and point source pollution? In the end, the idea is just that do you know exactly where it's coming from, or are you not really sure? Right? If like you wash your car in the driveway and the soap runs into the storm drain, but your neighbor did the same thing, we can't really pinpoint exactly which soap came from who, right? Um, is the watershed only the area where it collects or the entire area where all the water? I believe it's the entire area where all the water drains to a specific spot. So we have to call it like Santa Clara watershed, right? Where it's all this stuff in this general area would all drain to a specific area. Okay, let's see. Oh, I see another question. Oh, okay. Oh, there we go. What are a few threats to biodiversity? Well, again, remember CHIPO, right? Climate change, um, habitat fragmentation, invasive species, human population pollution, and overexploitation and overconsumption. Why is a mule or liger not considered biotic? It actually is. I believe someone told me that was one of the errors in one of the cahoots. Um, a mule or liger just means that it is still living, right? Uh, just because it can't reproduce doesn't make it therefore not living, right? It's a single example of where that particular organism cannot reproduce, but there are other aspects of it that clearly make it living. What is one of the most important? Okay, so to be honest, so the question is, what is one of the most important things that are on the test, and we need to know, and how, and could you explain it? It's all encompassing, right? It's everything from the last 6 weeks. So to be honest, I don't want you to feel like there's only one thing you need to know. I would say look at your review guide, look at your the kudos that I gave you at the beginning. But clearly, if we didn't talk about something, because that was something general to all the bio classes, and not worry about it. How does energy flow relate to metabolism? Again, that is energy flow is a way to, is how close is the okay. Um, Energy flow obviously is just how we're moving, energy through an ecosystem and a food chain, right? And one of the ways that the energy doesn't transfer is because of metabolism. How close is the review topics to the real test? Um, it is, I mean, like I said, it's all the stuff from the last 6 weeks. So it's not similar in format, but it's very similar in overall content, right? You should study your notes and all the different things we did. Um, okay. What type of ecosystem is the SF estuary? Again, it's, some of it is marshlands and wetlands. Some of it is, chaparral, which is like these low growing bushes. Like it depends on what area you're talking about. Um, what is the difference between an environment, habitat, and a niche? So environment is just the surrounding environment, like the the organisms and things that might live there. Habitat is where an organism lives. Niche kind of incorporates a lot of that, right? Where it's that the role that the organism plays in its ecosystem. So it's going to include where it lives, who eats it, who it eats, all those different things. What is a trophic cascade? Trophic cascade is the idea, and we watched a video. I think a lot of classes did about the wolves in Yellowstone. So with that, remember the idea is that when they took the wolves out, it basically caused elk and things like that to overgraze and things like that. So when they put the wolves back in, they saw not just a change to like the elk, but they saw this sort of effect on all the different levels of the ecosystem below it, right? It changed the river, and even the abiotic factors, like it changed how the rivers moved, it changed bird species. So there's the idea that it tumbles down from the top of the food chain. Um, okay, what is the difference between habitat loss and habitat fragmentation? Okay, so in both cases, it means that you are removing part of the organism's habitat, right? And that in and of itself is going to be problematic. Habitat loss means like we take it away, right? We plow through a wetland to build more condos. That's habitat loss. Now, the problem is, though, maybe we're not destroying the entire habitat, right? Like maybe in an area from here to San Francisco, we destroy parts of it, but parts of it are still there, right? So the parts that are still there are now fragmented. They're separated, they're not close together. So that's habitat fragmentation. Either way, the end result is you are taking away an organism's um, you know place to live and part of their ecosystem. And the problem too is now if you have like these pockets where they're still okay and they're living there but they're far away, then you might have populations get isolated from one another. They might have more trouble finding mates, things like that. Climate change again affects biodiversity because it really is just it's impacting their ecosystems. Okay, how I think you mean what effect does the process of acidification have on animals? I'm not sure what kind of animals you mean. Um, I think you might be referring to ocean animals, in which case, remember the ocean acidification is basically going to, especially for organisms who make their skeletons or exoskeletons out of calcium carbonate, like shells and things like that, that they can't do that as much. And so that's where it's going to have the impact. Also, it can impact just because, like a lower pH, right? Acidic things are going to affect all sorts of different aspects of the organism. Let's see. Edwin asks, could I explain how a sedimentary rock is a carbon sink? So a sink means someplace that carbon goes, right? So when the carbon sort of collects and compacts into a sedimentary rock, right, then that means it's actually being absorbed sort of into a rock, right? It's not being released into the atmosphere and things like that. So that's why it's a carbon sink, whereas um, other things might release it. That is not. What is the final characteristic of life besides made of cells, contains genetic code, grows and develops, able to reproduce, requires those are correct. I would also say that it can evolve. It's big. Um, let's see. Do we need to know specific examples of symbiotic relationships? For my students, no. I want you to be able to say, if I describe a relationship, that you can tell me if it's, um, you know, mutualism, commensalism, parasitism. But, I'm not going to say, like, tell me about this one thing. Like, no, I don't need you to do that. Joshua, yes, you need to know what CHIBO stands for. Definitely know that. Why do humans need healthy ecosystems to survive? Well, that's a really big question, right? But I mean, if you think about it, like, in order for us to have a lot of the things that we use to survive, we need those ecosystems to be functioning, right? I mean, um, plants and things like that. I mean, if we don't have them, and certainly like oxygen that we get from plants and healthy ecosystems, um, all those different medicines, like from there's a lot of natural cures that are out there that we don't want to go away and become extinct. Um, yeah, let's see. Chippo, climate change, yeah, habitat loss and fragmentation, invasive species, population, human population, pollution, and overexploitation, overconsumption. Um, okay, so it says, so does ocean acidification affect the waterway cycle? Um, I wouldn't say that it really affects the water cycle, no, because the water itself is not really, you know, it still can cycle, but the problem is that the organisms living in the water are being very negatively affected. Let's see. Any other questions? Let's see. I'll look at my list here while anyone puts. Oh, will we be tested from our water or biodiversity jigsaws? From the biodiversity jigsaw, no. No, I would know the general things on them, like just the big ideas, but no, because we also had some people absent and whatnot. Like, as long as you know the big idea of how biodiversity is affected from Chippo, that's what I need you to know. If the pH of water is lower, it has a higher acidity level. Yes. So the pH scale goes from 0 to 14, technically, I guess. The higher the number, like pH 14 means it's very, very basic. A lower pH um, is like pH 1 or 2, and that means it's really, really acidic. So, yeah, the lower the number for the pH, the more acidic it is. What is the general idea of climate change? And that's a really big question, right? It's the idea that as when climates change due to global warming, then there's all sorts of problems like the, extreme weather patterns, the droughts, etc. What is a limiting factor, and what limiting factors affect population? So a limiting factor means anything that um, limiting factor is anything that basically prevents a population from growing exponentially, right? So there's a lot of different things. It could be food, it could be shelter, it could be mates. I mean, so usually it's a combination of all those, right, that are affecting the populations. Can I explain what cellular restoration does? I can. I do want you to stress right now that don't get too caught up in the overall processes. You're going to see a lot of that in about 3-4 weeks when we get to that. But the let me see. So the overall idea of cellular respiration is it's a way for organisms, all organisms, plants, bacteria, us, to take glucose and convert it into a form of energy that our cells can use. And so the way that we do that is we actually take the glucose through a series of chemical reactions, use it to create another molecule called ATP. And then, but in the process, one of the products that we make is carbon dioxide. So that's where it releases carbon into the atmosphere. What is the real multiplier of pH from 6 to 5? It would be essentially it's a multiplier of 10. So we say like um, it's a logarithmic scale. So every time you move down, the pH scales by a factor of 10. So, um, pH 6 to pH 5 is like 10 times more acidic. Um, Sustainable water jigsaw. I would want you to know just the basic ideas of sort of how we try to make water more sustainable. So conservation, gray water recycling, desalination. Although again, that's not as as quite as feasible on a large level. Um, and then also, let's see, what am I missing? Conservation, gray water, um, desalination. I'm blanking on the last one. Um, let's see. As time passes, would the excess carbon in our, no, unfortunately, we don't think it is, right? I mean, well, it could. When you say clear out again, it's not going to just disappear, right? What's going to happen is it has to go somewhere. So in this case, a lot of it is getting absorbed into the oceans and causing the ocean acidification. But no, it's not just going to disappear, unfortunately, not unless there's some way it could clear out also like if plants take it in through photosynthesis, but it's not going to inherently just go away. Um, let's see. Can I explain the models for population growth? Yes. So there are two main models of population growth, right? What we call the J curve and the S curve. The J curve is what we call exponential growth. That is when you basically have um, the population basically keeps growing really, really quickly, almost like um, you know, doubling almost, but not quite. Um, So when it's growing and sort of just has no limit, that's exponential growth. But realistically, a population can't do that, right? There's usually some, if not more than one factor that's going to limit it. And so the second model is what we call logistic growth. And that's also called the S curve, which is to say, initially you see exponential growth, but then it levels off at what we call the carrying capacity, which is the maximum number of organisms that that environment can support. Okay, how have humans changed the upper ozone layer? Well, the idea is that humans previously were making a lot of products that had CFCs, and that destroyed the upper ozone layer. So now there's been what I think it's called the Montreal Protocol, which um, basically limited the number of CFCs that could be produced and therefore released, um, and that has helped the ozone layer to basically maintain and get better. Um, Scientists are lower ozone layer is seemingly decreasing, so they're still looking at that, but it's at least improved somewhat, at least in that level. How many level 3 questions will there be? Um, there will be one. Oh, sorry, level 3. You mean there will be, I haven't finished it. I'm still editing it, to be honest. So I don't have an exact number on that. But there will be only one of the level A, like the hardest ones. Can I upload this? Yes, the live stream will automatically upload when it's over. Um, what are 3 things that happen to CO2 when it's dissolved in water? Well, essentially, it's not that the CO2 does different things, like actually the same thing happens to it, but I guess you could say there are 3 things that might be consequences, right? Because when the CO2 gets dissolved in water, it basically converts into carbonic acid, and then that carbonic acid will transform into other things, and those ions are what kind of cause a lot of problems. So if we're talking about like effects of CO2 being dissolved in water, it's going to lower the pH of the ocean water. It's going to actually then also then affect the amount of calcium carbonate that um, the calcium carbonate that's organisms can have um, building their skeletons, right? And then just the lower pH is also going to affect functioning of organisms. To prevent Yes. So to prevent ocean acidification, yes, part of it is definitely reducing carbon dioxide emissions. What would be an example of a population under exponent? Well, so again, usually it's a portion of their growth, but not the whole thing. But at least organisms who can initially grow exponentially would be like bacteria. That would be a good example. Let's see. I don't see any questions right now, so I'll wait for a second. Um, Let me see. I do see a question here about oh, okay. What effect does ocean acidification have on marine organisms and humans? Um, oh, okay, hold on. I'll do that one first. Um, so again, ocean acidification is going to have multiple effects, right? Imagine taking a bath in acid, like vinegar instead of water, right? That's going to affect organs and systems and immune system, all sorts of things, right? So the lower pH of the oceans first of all affects them that way. It also again affects how well an organism can, if it has like a calcium carbonate skeleton, to build it. Global warming as a positive feedback loop. I actually answered that one earlier, so I will um, come back to that if I have time at the end here. What are the main human threats that impact biodiversity? Well, again, it's CHIPO, but if we're talking about the one that has the biggest impact, that would be habitat loss and fragmentation. Um, really quickly before I also, oh, can I explain waterways? Um, Okay, looks like I have two requests for waterways, so let's do that really quickly. Again, waterways is just the idea that water is moving all around in different areas, right? So um, there's lots of different water pathways, but if we sort of I'll try to diagram it for you. Oh, and really quickly, someone had asked about what the difference was between a food web and a food chain. Basically, a food chain is like part of a food web, right? Like the food web's just a little more complicated. Like you're now looking at not just like one like producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, but instead you're actually looking at like maybe for one plant, like all the different things that eat it, and then all the different things that eat the mouse that eat the plant that eats the plant, right? So there's going to be, it's just a little more complicated. It's honestly a little more realistic. Okay, so recap of the water cycle or waterway cycles. Remember again, there are there is the natural water cycle and there's the constructed water cycle, right? And again, waterways just means like how's water moving. So I've gone over the natural water cycle a lot, so I'm going to focus on um, the overall impact here of the constructed water cycle, right? So um, when we want to use the water, we have to sort of divert it from a natural pathway, right? So it could be that the percolation pond has dripped down into the aquifer, which is like an underground porous rock which contains water and trapped in between, right? So we could drill into the water cycle. We could draw into the aquifer, and then we could end up uh, taking taking that water and pumping it over to a water treatment plant. And when we pump it to the water treatment plant, then it would go to our houses. From our houses, it goes through the sewage system out to the um, you know wastewater treatment plant, etc. um, Biomagnification and bioaccumulation. Yes, I did explain it earlier, so you can always watch this and go back to the beginning. Or it's somewhere in the middle, so I'm not sure where, but yes, I did. And yes, Miss Lerner is about to go online as well. She would actually be a good person since I have to go soon to ask. I saw there was a lot of questions about. I think I didn't quite get to it. The positive feedback loop, because I know she covered that a lot. If you want to see that, again, my students, you don't need to know that, but if you're not um, not my student and that's something that your teacher stressed, that might be a good thing to ask Miss Lerner about since I need to go soon. Let me see. Um, Really quickly, how does the thawing of the permafrost increase global warming? Again, it's the idea that as the permafrost thaws, it's releasing carbon dioxide, right? And so that is going to increase the greenhouse gases. And when that happens, now we end up with more heat trapped, which means the global temperatures go up, etc. Okay, no problem. I'm glad I could help. Um, any last questions before I go? Unfortunately, I can't stay too much longer. I have three little kiddos who are probably not going to um, last much longer. Isn't the thawing of, yes, so it is. So that's why it's sort of like a loop, right? Like it makes it worse because it gets warmer, so the permafrost thaws, so then there's more CO2, and when there's more CO2, then it gets even warmer. So that's sort of that idea of the positive feedback loop. Oh, you guys are really nice. Thank you. No problem. If anybody does have questions later tonight, you are welcome to email me. I will be checking my email probably till at least 11:30 or so. I hope you guys are not all still up at that hour. Get some sleep. Remember that your brains are going to do better when you sleep. Eat a good breakfast. Um, but if you want to um, email me later, you can. Oh, looks like I have one last question. Is there a difference between overexploitation and overhar? Well, they're all kind of related, right? I mean, there is technically a difference, but they're all related, right? If we overharvest something, it means that we are sort of taking too much of it probably out of the, you know, the ecosystems, right? Overconsumption is a little broader term, right? Because if we use too many goods and things like that, then also that plays into things like how much energy it takes to make those goods and then replace those goods, etc. And then overexploitation again is the idea that we are just overusing a resource that is not going to have positive consequences. Okay, no problem. You guys are very welcome. I hope you have a good night, and just email me if you have any questions, or stop by tomorrow during brunch. I guess I'm not sure what our schedule is tomorrow. Okay. I am going to go now, I think. Let me figure out how to do this. Nope, that's not it. Oops. Oh, thank you. There's a little head. I have too many windows open.